The forgotten battle that nearly erased Western civilization overnight. The battlefield was already changing before the first sword was drawn. Somewhere beyond the horizon, armies were moving. Messengers were riding through dangerous roads carrying warnings that could alter the fate of kingdoms. Commanders studied incomplete reports. Political leaders debated uncertain information. And thousands of soldiers prepared to march without knowing that they were approaching one of the most dangerous moments in their civilization's history. Most people had no idea what was coming. Cities continued their daily routines. Markets remained open. Families went about their lives. Governments continued their disputes, believing that the existing order was strong enough to survive another crisis. But history was quietly moving toward a breaking point. Because civilizations are rarely destroyed in the moment they appear weakest, they fall when confidence remains high while hidden weaknesses begin to connect. A delayed decision, a misunderstood enemy, a fragile alliance, a commander trusting the wrong assumption, a military system prepared for yesterday's wars facing a completely different threat. Individually, these problems may seem manageable. Together, they can bring an entire world closer to collapse. This is the story of a forgotten battle that came dangerously close to changing the future of Western civilization. Not because one army disappeared and an entire culture vanished overnight. History is more complex than that. The true danger was that one catastrophic defeat could have broken the military and political structure protecting a civilization already facing enormous pressure. A single battlefield disaster could have opened new paths for enemies, encouraged rivals, weakened alliances, and transformed the balance of power in ways that would have affected generations. The people who lived through that moment did not know they were standing near a historical cliff. They did not know whether their armies would survive. They did not know whether their leaders understood the danger. They did not know whether the enemy they were preparing to face was simply another threat or the beginning of something far greater. They only knew that armies were gathering. And when those armies finally met, the outcome would depend on decisions made long before the battle began. The most fascinating part of this story is not simply who won or who lost. It is how close history came to taking a completely different path. Because when we look backward, survival often appears inevitable. We know the civilization continued. We know its ideas, institutions, and traditions influenced the world that followed. We know later generations inherited a world that seemed permanent. But the people living through the crisis had none of that certainty. For them, the future was still undecided. Every road remained open. A victory could reshape the political order. A defeat could trigger a chain of consequences no leader could fully control. And in the center of that uncertainty stood an army facing a question that has haunted commanders throughout history. What happens when the enemy understands your weaknesses before you recognize them yourself? To answer that question, we must return to the moment before disaster became visible. Before the battlefield became legendary. Before survivors could explain what happened. Before historians could debate its importance. Back to the days when the world still believed everything was under control. Because the most dangerous moment in history is often not when a civilization is falling. It is the moment just before it realizes it is in danger. Before the world knew it was in danger. Before the battle became a turning point in history, it was only a growing threat on distant horizons. For most people living inside the civilization that would soon face the crisis, nothing appeared unusual. There were no signs written across the sky announcing that a decisive moment was approaching. No public warning told ordinary citizens that the balance of power was shifting. Life continued. Farmers worked their lands. Merchants transported goods across familiar roads. Soldiers trained in established traditions. Political leaders focused on disputes that seemed urgent at the time. But beyond the borders, the situation was changing. An enemy was no longer simply a distant rival. It was becoming a force capable of challenging the foundations of an entire political order. The first signs appeared through information. Scouts reported unusual movements. Travelers carried rumors from distant regions. Messengers arrived with incomplete descriptions of enemy preparations. Some reports sounded alarming, others seemed exaggerated, and that created the first major problem. When danger arrives gradually, people rarely recognize the exact moment when caution should become action. A sudden attack forces a response. A slow-moving threat creates debate. Was the enemy truly preparing for a major campaign? Were the reports accurate? Was mobilizing a large army necessary, or would it create unnecessary costs and political instability? These questions were not easy to answer. The leaders facing the crisis were not ignoring an obvious disaster. They were making decisions inside uncertainty. That is what makes this moment historically important. The greatest mistakes in history are often not made because people refuse to see reality. They are made because reality arrives in pieces. A single report may not seem significant. A single delay may not seem dangerous. A single political disagreement may not appear capable of changing the future. But history is shaped by accumulation. Small decisions create larger consequences. By the time the danger becomes impossible to deny, the choices available are often far more limited than they were before. This was the situation developing before the forgotten battle. The civilization still possessed enormous advantages. It had experienced commanders. It had trained soldiers. It had political influence. It had resources that many enemies could only dream of possessing. From the outside, it appeared powerful, and that appearance created confidence. But power and security are not the same thing. A state can be wealthy and still vulnerable. An army can be experienced and still be unprepared. A government can control vast territories and still struggle to respond quickly when a new threat appears. The enemy understood something that many inside the threatened civilization did not fully appreciate. Strength is not only measured by what a nation possesses, it is measured by how quickly that strength can be transformed into action. And transformation requires time. Armies must gather. Orders must travel. Supplies must be collected. Allies must be convinced. Commanders must agree. Every step creates opportunities for delay. Every delay creates opportunities for the enemy. The approaching conflict was therefore not beginning with the clash of weapons. It was beginning with a race between preparation and reaction, between those who were creating the crisis and those who were trying to understand it. The enemy had the advantage of initiative. They could choose the moment to move. They could decide where pressure would be applied. They could force their opponents to respond to events rather than control them. This is one of the oldest principles of warfare. The side that controls the pace of events often controls the battlefield before the battle even begins. Yet the greatest danger was not only military, it was psychological. Powerful civilizations often develop confidence from previous survival. They remember the threats they defeated. They remember enemies who failed. They remember moments when their strength was proven. But past victories can create a dangerous assumption that future enemies will fail in the same way. That assumption can become a weakness. The world changes. Enemies adapt. Strategies evolve. A method that protected a civilization for decades may become ineffective when facing a different kind of challenge. And while leaders debated the scale of the threat, the enemy was already creating a new reality. Armies were moving, plans were forming. The possibility of confrontation was becoming more likely with every passing day. The people who would later remember the battle as a near catastrophe did not know that the final peaceful moments were already disappearing. They were living through the last stage before history accelerated. Soon, the warnings would become impossible to dismiss. Soon, commanders would have to make decisions without enough time, information, or certainty. Soon, the question would no longer be whether danger existed. The question would be whether anything could still be done to stop it. Because by the time a civilization finally recognizes the storm approaching, the first drops of rain have already fallen, and the invisible chain leading to disaster had already begun. the invisible chain that made disaster possible. The battle that nearly changed the future of Western civilization was not created on the battlefield. The battlefield was only where the consequences finally became visible. Long before armies stood face to face, a series of decisions, delays, political calculations, and misunderstandings had already begun pushing events toward confrontation. No single choice created the crisis. That is what makes the story more dangerous. Disasters in history rarely announce themselves with one obvious mistake. They develop slowly, through decisions that appear reasonable when viewed individually. A ruler delays action because information is uncertain. A commander waits for stronger confirmation before moving troops. An ally hesitates because committing soldiers could weaken its own defenses. A government prioritizes another threat because it appears more immediate. Each decision has logic. Each decision seems temporary. But when combined, they create a situation where every future choice becomes more difficult. The invisible chain had begun. One of the greatest challenges facing the defenders was understanding the true intentions of their enemy. Was this a limited campaign? A political demonstration of strength? A raid designed to gain resources? Or the beginning of something much larger? The answer determined everything. If leaders underestimated the danger, they risked being unprepared. If they overestimated it, they could waste resources, create unnecessary panic, and weaken themselves politically. The enemy benefited from this uncertainty. A force preparing an attack does not need to reveal every objective immediately. Sometimes confusion itself becomes a weapon. When an opponent is forced to question every movement, every report, and every possibility, decision-making slows. And in warfare, time is a resource. The side that loses time often loses options. The political environment made the situation even more complicated. Strong civilizations are rarely controlled by one person making one decision. Behind every major military action are competing interests. Generals want resources. Politicians want stability. Allies want protection, but also want to preserve their own power. Local leaders want security but may not want to sacrifice their people for a distant conflict. Every group sees the crisis through a different perspective. This creates a dangerous weakness. A civilization can understand that a threat exists and still struggle to respond effectively. Everyone may agree that action is necessary. The disagreement comes from deciding what action should be taken, who should provide the resources, and who should accept the risk. Those debates consume time. The enemy does not wait for political unity. While leaders negotiate, armies continue preparing. While officials debate possibilities, soldiers require food, weapons, and transportation. While alliances are discussed, the strategic situation changes. This is why timing became one of the most important factors in the coming confrontation. A decision made early could have created a completely different battlefield. A force positioned sooner could have changed the balance. A stronger alliance could have removed uncertainty. A warning delivered faster could have prevented surprise, but history is not shaped by the decisions people wish they had made. It is shaped by the decisions available at the time. And by the time the danger became undeniable, many of the easier options had already disappeared. The defenders were no longer choosing between success and failure. They were choosing between different levels of risk. This is the moment when crises become difficult to escape. A leader can no longer simply return to the situation that existed before the problem began. The enemy is stronger. The political costs are higher. The military response requires more resources. The consequences of delay become greater. The entire system begins moving toward a point where events themselves start forcing decisions. That point was approaching. The armies that would eventually meet were not just the result of military ambition. They were the result of years of accumulated choices, every unresolved disagreement, every underestimated warning, every delayed response, every assumption about what the enemy would or would not do. All of them were becoming part of the battlefield. And yet, There was one final element that made the coming confrontation even more dangerous. The men who would command these armies believed they understood the situation. They had studied the enemy. They had analyzed previous conflicts. They had experience. They had confidence. But confidence built on the wrong assumption can become more dangerous than ignorance. Because a commander who knows he lacks information searches for answers. A commander who believes he already understands the situation may stop looking. And that was the mistake waiting at the center of the crisis. The battle would not only test the strength of armies, it would test the accuracy of the beliefs that sent those armies into motion. The fate of a civilization was about to depend on what its leaders thought they knew, and what they never realized they did not know. The men who bet their world on one assumption. Armies are not defeated only by weapons. Sometimes they are defeated by what their commanders believe. Before the battle began, the leaders responsible for protecting their civilization were not blindly walking into danger. They had experience. They had intelligence reports. They had military traditions built through generations of conflict. They believed they understood the situation, and that belief was about to be tested. Every commander faces the same impossible challenge. He must make decisions about an enemy he cannot fully see. A battlefield does not reveal the future. It only provides fragments. A scout reports movement in one direction. A messenger describes enemy preparations somewhere else. A captured soldier claims one objective. A local informant provides completely different information. The commander must decide which information matters, which reports are reliable, which threats are real, which possibilities can be ignored. The problem is that a wrong assumption does not immediately look like a mistake. It often looks like common sense. A commander does not prepare for every possible action an enemy could take. That would be impossible. He prepares for the actions he believes are most likely. The entire military strategy depends on those expectations. If the enemy moves where expected, the plan works. If the enemy behaves differently, the plan begins to collapse. This was the danger facing the leaders before the forgotten battle. They believed the enemy had limits. They believed certain movements were unlikely. They believed geography, supplies, and military realities would restrict what the opposing force could accomplish. Those assumptions were reasonable. But reasonable does not always mean correct. History is filled with examples of powerful armies losing because they prepared for the enemy they expected rather than the enemy that actually appeared. The greatest strategic surprises do not happen because leaders have no information. They happen because leaders interpret information through the wrong framework. They see what they expect to see. They give more importance to reports that confirm their beliefs. They dismiss warnings that challenge their understanding. This is not unique to warfare. It is a human weakness. When a person has confidence in a system that has worked before, changing that system becomes difficult. Success creates habits. Habits create assumptions. Assumptions create vulnerabilities. The commanders preparing for this battle carried the weight of previous victories. Their armies had succeeded before. Their methods had produced results. Their opponents had often reacted in predictable ways. That history created confidence. But confidence can become dangerous when it removes curiosity. A commander who believes he already understands the enemy stops searching for unexpected possibilities, and unexpected possibilities are exactly where history often changes. The enemy did not need to be stronger in every category. It needed to force the defenders into conditions where their strengths became less useful. That required understanding how the opposing army thought. How would they react to pressure? Would they advance directly? Would they seek a long campaign? Would they avoid a decisive confrontation? Would they follow traditional military patterns? The answers to these questions determined where forces were placed, when troops moved, and how resources were distributed. A single incorrect prediction could affect thousands of soldiers. If reinforcements were positioned too far away, they could not help when needed. If reserves were held back against the wrong threat, they could become irrelevant. If defensive positions were chosen based on false expectations, soldiers could find themselves fighting from disadvantageous ground. The battlefield would eventually expose every assumption, but by then, it would be too late to reconsider. This is what makes command decisions so unforgiving. A mistake made before battle can become impossible to correct once combat begins. A soldier can adjust his movement. A small unit can change direction. A commander controlling an entire army cannot turn thousands of men instantly. Every order travels through a chain of people. Every change requires time. Every delay creates consequences. The commanders also faced another problem. They were not only fighting an enemy, they were fighting uncertainty. A battlefield creates a dangerous psychological environment where leaders are constantly forced to choose between action and patience. Act too quickly, and they may fall into a trap. Wait too long, and the enemy may gain an advantage that cannot be recovered. There is no perfect moment, only decisions made with incomplete knowledge. This pressure becomes even greater when the fate of an entire political system appears connected to the army's success. The commanders were not simply protecting a battlefield position, they were protecting confidence. If the army survived, allies would remain loyal. If the army collapsed, enemies would become bolder. A defeat could create political consequences far beyond the soldiers who fought. That knowledge increased the pressure on every decision. The commanders understood what was at stake. They knew that failure would not be measured only in casualties. It would be measured in territory lost, alliances broken, and enemies encouraged. But knowing the consequences does not make the right decision easier. Sometimes it makes the burden heavier. The leaders approaching this confrontation had to choose based on the world as they understood it. The problem was that the world they understood was changing. The enemy was adapting. The political situation was shifting. The battlefield conditions were becoming different from those that had shaped their previous experience. And the most dangerous sentence a commander can believe is, "This worked before." Because warfare punishes repetition when circumstances change. The army that had protected a civilization in previous conflicts was about to face a challenge that would expose whether its methods still matched reality. Its soldiers were disciplined, its officers were experienced, its traditions were respected, but the coming battle would ask a harder question, not whether the army knew how to fight, whether it knew how to fight this enemy, because the difference between those two questions would determine everything. The commanders had placed their trust in one central belief. That belief had shaped their plans. It had influenced their movements. It had determined where they considered danger most likely to appear. And when the enemy finally revealed its true intentions, the defenders would discover something terrifying. The greatest threat was not only the strength of the opposing army, it was the possibility that they had prepared perfectly for a battle that would never happen. The army built for the wrong kind of war. The army approaching the battlefield was not weak. That is what makes the coming crisis so remarkable. It was not a force of inexperienced soldiers thrown into a hopeless situation. It was an army shaped by years of warfare, discipline, tradition, and previous victories. Its soldiers knew how to fight. Its officers knew how to command. Its formations had been tested. Its weapons had been improved through generations of conflict. On paper, it possessed everything a powerful military needed. But history has repeatedly shown that an army can be excellent at one type of war and dangerously vulnerable in another. The problem was not a lack of strength. The problem was a mismatch between preparation and reality. Every military system is built around assumptions. An army decides how soldiers should move, how units should support each other, how commanders should communicate, and how victory should be achieved. Those methods become effective because they match the enemies and environments the army has faced before. But when the nature of the conflict changes, the same strengths can become weaknesses. A formation designed for stability may struggle against speed. A strategy built around direct confrontation may fail against deception. A force trained to win through discipline may suffer when the battlefield becomes unpredictable. The defenders were prepared for a war they understood. The danger was that the enemy intended to create a war They did not. The strength of a traditional army often comes from order. Thousands of soldiers moving together, officers maintaining discipline, units supporting each other, commands passing through a clear structure. This organization creates power, but it also creates dependence. A highly coordinated army needs communication. It needs reliable information. It needs commanders who understand what is happening around them. When those elements disappear, the same organization that creates strength can become difficult to adapt. A battlefield does not remain organized for long. Smoke hides movement. Noise destroys communication. Terrain separates units. Messengers become delayed. Orders become outdated. A commander may send instructions based on a situation that no longer exists by the time those instructions arrive. This creates the greatest challenge of combat. The battlefield moves faster than command. An army can still have brave soldiers and skilled officers while losing the ability to function as a single force. That is when the enemy gains an advantage, not necessarily because it has more soldiers, because it can create more uncertainty. The enemy understood that defeating this army did not require destroying every soldier individually. It required attacking the system that connected those soldiers, break communication, create confusion, force units to respond independently, make commanders question their own information. Once that happens, numbers become less important. A large army without coordination becomes thousands of separate groups. A smaller army with initiative can force a larger opponent to react continuously. This was the danger approaching the battlefield. The defenders had experience. But experience can be complicated. It teaches lessons. It creates confidence. It provides a foundation for decision-making. Yet experience can also become a limitation when it convinces leaders that future conflicts will resemble previous ones. The battles that built an army's reputation may not prepare it for the battle that threatens its existence. A soldier trained to fight a familiar enemy may discover that the new opponent uses different methods. A commander who expects a predictable confrontation may find himself facing constant surprises. A military tradition built around control may struggle against an enemy whose greatest advantage is creating disorder. This is how powerful armies can be defeated. Not because they lack ability, because their ability is designed for the wrong conditions. The battlefield itself would amplify these weaknesses. Terrain would influence movement. Distance would slow communication. The timing of reinforcements would become critical. Every decision would depend on information that might already be outdated. The army would need to do something extremely difficult. It would need to abandon certainty and adapt while under pressure. But adaptation during combat is not easy. Before battle, commanders can study maps. They can debate strategies. They can train soldiers. They can prepare alternatives. During battle, every mistake has a cost. A formation that moves too slowly can expose another unit. A reserve committed too early cannot respond later. A delayed order can become a lost opportunity. A misunderstanding can become a disaster. There is no pause button, no opportunity to restart. The battle continues while leaders attempt to understand it. This is where the difference between a strong army and a flexible army becomes clear. Strength allows an army to survive difficult situations. Flexibility allows an army to change when difficult situations become impossible. The defenders possessed strength. The question was whether they possessed enough flexibility, because the enemy was not approaching merely to test their courage. It was approaching to challenge the entire way they fought. The coming battle would expose every weakness hidden beneath years of success. The formations, the command structure, the assumptions about enemy behavior, the belief that traditional methods could solve a new problem. Everything would be tested. And once the first movements began, there would be no time to redesign the army. The soldiers would have to fight with the system they had. The commanders would have to make decisions with the information they possessed. The civilization behind them would depend on whether that was enough. Because the greatest danger facing this army was not that it was too weak. It was that it was strong in exactly the ways the enemy knew how to overcome. And when the battle finally began, The difference between preparation and reality would become impossible to ignore. The hours history could not control. The battle began with plans. It ended with chaos. Every commander enters a battlefield believing he can control the outcome through preparation, discipline, and strategy. Before the first clash, everything appears organized. Units have positions, orders have been delivered, objectives have been defined. Every soldier knows where he is expected to stand, but the moment armies collide, the battlefield begins creating problems that no plan can completely predict. A battlefield is not a map. It does not remain still. It changes every minute. The first movements may follow expectations. A formation advances. Another responds. A commander observes the enemy and adjusts. But then reality begins separating from the original strategy. A unit arrives later than expected. A message fails to reach its destination. An enemy movement appears larger than predicted. A position believed to be secure suddenly becomes vulnerable. Small disruptions begin creating larger consequences, and once enough things change at the same time, even experienced commanders can lose control of the battle they prepared for. This is where the forgotten battle became something more than a military confrontation. It became a struggle between human plans and unpredictable reality. The commanders on both sides were trying to understand a battlefield they could never fully see. From a distance, historians can examine the entire engagement. They can see movements. They can identify mistakes. They can explain why one decision created another consequence. The soldiers inside the battle had none of that perspective. They saw only what existed around them. A wall of enemies approaching, a commander shouting orders, a formation moving, a standard disappearing through smoke and dust, a neighboring unit suddenly changing direction. For ordinary soldiers, the battle was not a grand strategic event. It was survival. The sounds alone could create confusion. Thousands of men moving across the battlefield produced a constant storm of noise, weapons striking armor, commands being shouted, animals panicking, wounded soldiers calling for help, officers attempting to maintain order. The battlefield became a place where information was valuable, but extremely difficult to obtain. And without information, even the strongest army becomes vulnerable. A commander might believe one section of the battlefield was holding while it was already collapsing. He might send reinforcements toward a threat that had already disappeared. He might ignore a movement that looked insignificant but represented the beginning of a larger attack. Every decision depended on understanding a situation that was changing faster than reports could arrive. This created the most dangerous moment in warfare. The moment when commanders must act before they know enough. Waiting for certainty is impossible. By the time certainty arrives, the opportunity may already be gone. So commanders make decisions. Some are brilliant, some are disastrous. Most exist somewhere between the two. The enemy understood this. A battle is not only a physical contest, it is a contest of pressure. Force the opponent to react constantly, and his ability to think clearly begins to weaken. Create several problems at once, and he must choose which danger matters most. Make every choice carry a risk, and eventually even a strong army begins fighting defensively. The defenders were facing exactly this challenge. Their strength depended on organization. Their enemy was creating conditions where organization became increasingly difficult. The battlefield was becoming fragmented. Groups of soldiers fought battles within the larger battle. One unit could be advancing successfully, while another struggled nearby. One commander could believe victory was possible, while another was already trying to prevent disaster. The entire army no longer experienced one shared reality. It experienced thousands of individual moments. This is why battles can turn so quickly. A force does not collapse only when soldiers are killed. It collapses when enough soldiers no longer understand what is happening, when communication breaks, when confidence disappears, when men begin making decisions based on fear rather than orders. The enemy did not need every soldier to panic. It only needed uncertainty to spread faster than control could be restored. The first signs may have been subtle. a formation slowing, a gap appearing, a command ignored because it was never heard, a unit looking for support that never arrived. Then those small problems began connecting. A weakened position required reinforcement. The reinforcement left another area exposed. The exposed area created another emergency. The commander responded again. The army was no longer following a plan. It was reacting to consequences. This is the moment when battles are often decided, not when one side is completely destroyed, but when one side loses the ability to determine what happens next. The initiative changes hands. The side controlling events gains confidence. The side reacting begins losing options, and options are everything in war. An army with several possible responses can survive difficult situations. An army forced into only one response becomes predictable. The enemy can anticipate it, exploit it, pressure it. The defenders were beginning to face that reality. Their commanders still had authority. Their soldiers still had weapons. Their army had not disappeared, but the battlefield was becoming something their original strategy had not prepared them for. A situation where every solution created another problem, where every movement required another reaction, where time itself became an enemy. The longer the battle continued, the more difficult it became to restore order. Men became exhausted. Units lost cohesion. Equipment suffered damage. Officers disappeared. Information became less reliable. An army that begins the day as a precise instrument can become something very different after hours of continuous combat. It becomes a collection of exhausted individuals trying to survive, and that is when the psychological battle becomes as important as the physical one. Soldiers fight harder when they believe victory remains possible. They endure incredible suffering when they trust that their actions matter. But when they begin believing that the situation cannot be repaired, courage becomes harder to maintain. The question changes. At the beginning, how do we defeat the enemy? Later, can we still survive? That transition is one of the most important moments in any battle. Because once an army begins fighting only for survival, the entire meaning of the confrontation changes. The battlefield is no longer about gaining advantage. It is about preventing destruction. And as the hours passed, that was the reality facing the defenders. The battle they entered expecting to win was becoming a battle they needed to escape. But escape would not be simple. An army cannot retreat the same way it advances. Advancing requires movement toward opportunity. Retreat requires movement away from danger while maintaining enough order to avoid collapse. The enemy was still present. The roads were uncertain. The soldiers were exhausted. The decisions made in the next moments would determine whether defeat remained temporary or became something far worse. Because history often remembers who won a battle. But the fate of civilizations is sometimes decided by what happens after victory or defeat becomes possible. And now the defenders face the most difficult question of all, not how to win, how much of their army could survive. When survival became more important than victory. At the beginning of the battle, the objective was clear. The commanders wanted to defeat the enemy. They wanted to break its formations, force a retreat, and prove that their civilization still possessed the military strength to control its own destiny. But battles do not always follow the intentions of those who begin them. As the hours passed, the question changed. Victory was no longer the priority. Survival was. This transformation is one of the most dangerous moments an army can experience because it represents more than a tactical setback. It represents a change in purpose. An army fighting for victory believes the future is still something it can shape. An army fighting for survival is trying to prevent the future from being taken away. The defenders were beginning to understand that the battle they had prepared for was no longer the battle they were actually fighting. The enemy had disrupted their plans. Their formations were under pressure. Communication had become unreliable. The battlefield was moving faster than their ability to respond. But the army was not destroyed. And that created the most difficult decision of all. Should they continue fighting for an unlikely victory? Or should they preserve what remained before the defeat became irreversible? This is the moment when commanders face the cruelest calculation in war. A commander who retreats too early may surrender a battle that could still be won. A commander who waits too long may destroy the very army needed to continue the struggle. The difference between those two choices can be measured in minutes, and those minutes can determine the fate of nations. Retreat is often misunderstood. Many imagine it as simple movement away from danger. In reality, a controlled retreat is one of the most complex operations an army can perform. The soldiers must move while maintaining discipline. Officers must prevent panic. Routes must remain open. Enemy pressure must be delayed. The wounded must be considered. Equipment must be abandoned or preserved depending on what matters most. Every decision requires accepting a painful loss. Something must be sacrificed. Ground, supplies, weapons, reputation, sometimes even entire units. The goal is no longer to protect everything. The goal is to save enough. That is what separates a defeated army from a destroyed army. A defeated army can return. It can reorganize. It can recruit. It can defend again. A destroyed army leaves a vacuum. And when that army represents the main barrier protecting a civilization, the consequences extend far beyond the battlefield. The commanders understood this danger. The soldiers may not have known the full strategic picture, but they could feel the change. They noticed the movement of units around them. They saw exhausted men returning from the front. They heard different orders coming from different directions. They watched officers trying to restore formations that were no longer operating as they had at the beginning of the day. The psychological weight was enormous. Fear does not always appear as immediate panic. Sometimes it appears as uncertainty. A soldier does not need to run away to lose confidence. He only needs to begin asking, does my commander know what is happening? Are the soldiers beside me still holding? Is there a way out if things collapse? Those questions can spread silently through an army, and once soldiers begin thinking about survival individually, maintaining collective discipline becomes much harder. The enemy understood this. A broken formation is not always created by physical destruction. Sometimes it is created when enough people believe destruction is unavoidable. That belief changes behavior. Men stop advancing. Units hesitate. Orders become harder to enforce. Every movement becomes slower, and slowness on a battlefield can become fatal. But the defenders still had one advantage. They were not only fighting against the enemy was also fighting against time. The victorious side had spent hours attacking. Its soldiers were exhausted. Its commanders were making decisions under the same uncertainty. Its formations had suffered losses. Its ability to maintain constant pressure was not unlimited. This created a narrow possibility. If enough of the army survived the critical moments, defeat could remain temporary. The enemy could win the battlefield without achieving the complete destruction it needed. That distinction would become one of the most important consequences of the battle. Because military victories are often judged by what is gained, but strategic victories are determined by what the enemy loses. A battlefield victory that leaves the opponent capable of recovering may not achieve the political transformation the winner desires. The defenders were fighting for that possibility. Every unit that held together mattered. Every officer who maintained order mattered. Every soldier who continued following commands mattered. The future depended on fragments. A civilization does not always survive because it wins decisively. Sometimes it survives because enough pieces remain after disaster. This is why the actions of ordinary soldiers can become historically significant. Most men on a battlefield do not know the consequences of their individual decisions. A soldier holding a position for another 5 minutes does not know that those minutes may allow thousands to escape. An officer organizing scattered troops does not know that he may be preserving the foundation of a future army. A commander choosing withdrawal over destruction does not know whether later generations will see him as cautious or brilliant. They are making choices without knowing the ending. That is the reality of history from the inside. Nobody fights knowing the final outcome. Nobody knows which moments will become important. Nobody knows which small decisions will separate survival from collapse. As the battle moved toward its final stages, the defenders were no longer trying to prove superiority. They were trying to preserve possibility, and possibility is sometimes the most valuable thing an army can protect. Because as long as an army survives, the war is not over. As long as political leadership remains, the state is not defeated completely. As long as resistance exists, the enemy has not achieved total victory. The battlefield had changed the meaning of success. The soldiers who entered the fight hoping to win were now fighting to ensure that losing this battle would not mean losing everything. And that created a new problem for the victors. They had achieved what every commander dreams of. They had broken the enemy's plans. They had gained control of the battlefield. They had created a historic opportunity. But now they faced the hardest question after any great victory. Was defeating the enemy enough? Or had they only created the beginning of a much larger struggle? The victory that created a new problem. A battlefield victory creates a powerful illusion. For the soldiers who survive, the moment feels like the end of uncertainty. The enemy has been defeated. The battlefield belongs to them. The threat that forced thousands of men into combat appears to have been removed. But history often reveals something different. The hardest moment for a victorious army is sometimes not the battle itself. It is what comes after. Because winning a battle and achieving the purpose of a war are two completely different things. The victors now faced a problem they had not fully anticipated. They had created an extraordinary opportunity. But opportunities must be transformed into results, and that requires more than military strength. It requires supplies, political decisions, strategic patience, reliable information, the ability to understand what the enemy will do next. The battlefield had given them success. It had not given them unlimited power. This is one of the great paradoxes of warfare. A victory can make an army appear stronger while actually creating new vulnerabilities. The enemy has been damaged, but the victorious army has also been exhausted. Soldiers who fought for hours are not the same soldiers who began the day. Weapons have been damaged. Animals are tired. Officers have been lost. Units are no longer operating at full strength. The army that stands victorious is not an untouched force. It is a force that has paid a price. The question becomes whether that price was worth the opportunity created. The victors now had several possible paths. They could pursue the defeated enemy and attempt to destroy what remained of its military power. They could stop and secure their position. They could use their victory to pressure political leaders into surrender. They could reorganize before continuing. Each option carried risks. Move too quickly, and they could outrun their own support. Move too slowly, and the enemy could recover. This was the strategic dilemma hidden inside their success. The defeated army was damaged, but not necessarily gone. Survivors were gathering. Commanders were reorganizing. Scattered units were searching for one another. A military force can suffer a devastating defeat and still remain dangerous if enough of its structure survives. The victors knew this. But destroying a retreating enemy requires more than desire. It requires the ability to continue, and every step forward created new challenges. Distance became an enemy. The farther an army advanced, the more difficult it became to maintain supplies. Every soldier required food. Every animal required resources. Every piece of equipment required maintenance. Every message required safe communication routes. An army does not move through empty space. It moves through a world filled with uncertainty. Local populations could cooperate or resist. Roads could remain open or become obstacles. Resources could be available or disappear before the army arrived. A successful campaign depends not only on defeating enemies, it depends on controlling everything that allows an army to continue existing. This is why many great victories throughout history failed to become permanent conquests. The battlefield solved one problem. Logistics created another. The victors also faced a political challenge. Military success changes relationships. Allies who once depended on the victorious power may begin demanding rewards. Neutral leaders may reconsider their position. Rivals within the winning coalition may begin competing for influence. Before the battle, unity often comes easily. Everyone agrees on the immediate threat. After victory, disagreements return. The question changes from, how do we survive, to, who benefits from our success? This can weaken even the strongest campaigns. An enemy does not always need to defeat an invading army directly. Sometimes it only needs to survive long enough for the victor's advantages to decline. Time can become a weapon. Every day that passes allows the defeated side to recover. Every delay gives uncertain allies more opportunities to change their minds. Every disagreement creates openings. This is why the aftermath of the battle was so important. The victors had achieved what many commanders dream of. They had proven their superiority on the battlefield, but the true measure of their success would be whether they could convert that moment into lasting change. And that was far from guaranteed, because the enemy had learned something as well. Defeat is not only destruction, it is information. The survivors now understood the methods that had been used against them. They understood the strengths of the victorious army. They understood its weaknesses. They understood where mistakes had been made. A defeated force that survives becomes more dangerous because it adapts. The first battle reveals reality. The second battle is fought by people who understand that reality better. This created a race between recovery and exploitation. Could the victors move quickly enough to take advantage of their success? Or would the defeated side recover before the opportunity disappeared? The answer would depend on decisions made after the battlefield was already silent. And this is where history becomes less dramatic, but even more important. Wars are not decided only by moments of courage. They are decided by what leaders do when the obvious moment has passed. A brilliant victory can be wasted by poor decisions afterward. A terrible defeat can be survived through adaptation. The battlefield had created a new reality, but it had not determined the final outcome. The victors now stood at the height of their power. The enemy was wounded. The future seemed open. Yet beneath that apparent triumph existed a hidden danger. The greatest victories often create the greatest expectations, and expectations can become a weakness. The victorious side believed it had changed history. Perhaps it had, but changing history and controlling history are not the same thing. Because beyond the battlefield, another struggle had already begun. A struggle of survival. A struggle of recovery. A struggle over whether one devastating defeat would become the end of a civilization's resistance or merely one chapter in a longer conflict. And the answer would depend on something no commander could fully control: the unpredictable nature of history itself. The history that survived by accident. History often remembers the decisions of kings, generals, and political leaders. But sometimes the survival of an entire civilization depends on moments that nobody planned. A delayed message, a soldier who escaped, a commander who hesitated, a road that remained open, a unit that held its position a few minutes longer. These events rarely appear in the official story. They do not create monuments. They do not become symbols of national pride. Yet they can determine whether a disaster becomes complete or whether a civilization survives long enough to recover. That was the hidden reality after the forgotten battle. The defenders had lost control of the battlefield. Their plans had failed. Their army had suffered a devastating blow, but defeat had not become destruction. And the difference between those two outcomes was measured by countless small moments. The victors had achieved the result every commander desires. They had broken the enemy's strategy, but they had not erased the enemy's ability to continue. This created the most unpredictable factor in history: possibility. As long as survivors remained, the future was not decided. A defeated commander could reorganize, a scattered army could reform, a damaged political system could recover, a frightened population could regain confidence. None of these outcomes were guaranteed, but they remained possible, and possibility is often enough to change history. The first element of survival was human. The men who escaped the battlefield carried more than their own lives. They carried experience. They carried knowledge of what had happened. They knew how the enemy fought. They understood where mistakes had been made. They knew which decisions had failed. A destroyed army removes not only soldiers, it removes memory. Veterans are not valuable only because they can fight. They are valuable because they know how to rebuild. They understand organization. They understand discipline. They understand what panic looks like and how to prevent it. A new army can be recruited. A new generation of experience takes much longer to create. This is why incomplete defeat can be so dangerous for a victorious enemy. The enemy has won, but it has not removed the foundation from which future resistance can grow. Then came the role of communication. In the ancient world, information moved at the speed of a person, an animal, or a ship. There were no instant reports, no complete battlefield view. No way for leaders to know everything happening at once. A message could arrive in time and change history. The same message arriving hours later could become meaningless. A warning could save an army. A delayed order could destroy one. A request for reinforcements could transform the outcome of a campaign, but only if it reached the right person at the right moment. This made individuals unexpectedly important. A messenger riding through dangerous territory could influence the fate of thousands without ever understanding the importance of his mission. He was not a famous general. He did not command armies. He simply carried information. Yet the success or failure of that journey could decide what happened next. This is one of the uncomfortable truths of history. Great events are not controlled only by great people. They are shaped by ordinary individuals performing ordinary tasks during extraordinary moments. A soldier guarding a road, a scout observing enemy movement, a local guide choosing whether to cooperate, a wounded officer refusing to abandon his men. Each person becomes a small connection in a chain. Break enough connections and a civilization collapses. Preserve enough and it survives. The role of chance was equally important. Both sides made mistakes. Both sides misunderstood events. Both sides acted with incomplete knowledge. The victors did not possess perfect control. They were also reacting to uncertainty. A commander could make a correct decision and still fail because circumstances changed. Another commander could make a risky decision and succeed because the enemy responded unexpectedly. This is what makes history different from a simple story of strength defeating weakness. The stronger side does not always win. The smarter side does not always win. The side with more resources does not always win. Events happen inside an environment where human decisions interact with unpredictable circumstances. That does not mean strategy is irrelevant. Leadership matters. Preparation matters. Military skill matters. But they operate within limits. The greatest commanders in history understood this. They prepared carefully because they knew they could not control everything. The danger came from those who believed victory had removed uncertainty. The victors had achieved something extraordinary, but their success also created confidence, and confidence after victory can become dangerous. It can encourage leaders to underestimate remaining threats. It can make them believe the enemy is already defeated. It can convince them that future resistance is impossible. Meanwhile, the survivors gain something valuable. Time. Time to reorganize. Time to communicate. Time to rebuild morale. Time for fear to weaken. The psychological impact of survival cannot be underestimated. A defeated civilization often faces a critical moment after disaster. People ask whether resistance is still possible. If the answer appears to be no, collapse can accelerate. But if evidence of survival appears, confidence can return. One surviving army unit, one successful defensive action, one leader who remains capable, one ally that refuses to abandon the cause. These events can change perception, and perception influences decisions. A city that believes defeat is inevitable may surrender. A city that believes resistance remains possible may fight. A political leader who believes the government is finished may flee. A leader who believes recovery is possible may continue. The difference between collapse and survival can begin with belief. That is why the aftermath of the battle mattered as much as the battle itself. The victors had created a crisis, but they had not created certainty. The future remained contested. The civilization that appeared closest to destruction still possessed something the enemy could not remove in one day: the ability to continue. And sometimes continuation is the first step toward recovery. History is full of moments when the outcome seemed decided. An empire appears finished. A kingdom appears defeated. A military force appears destroyed. Then something unexpected happens. Someone survives. Someone rebuilds. Someone refuses to accept that the story has ended. The forgotten battle became one of those moments, not because it produced an immediate reversal, not because the defeated side suddenly became stronger, but because the final outcome depended on more than the battlefield. It depended on everything that happened afterward. The decisions nobody celebrated, the people nobody remembered, the opportunities nobody could predict. The accidents that history quietly absorbed. Because sometimes civilizations do not survive because they were unbeatable. They survive because at the exact moment they were closest to falling, something prevented the final blow from landing. And that leads to the final question. If the civilization survived, why did later generations forget how close it came to disappearing? Why did the danger fade from memory? Why do people remember the world that survived, but forget the world that almost replaced it? The answer reveals the final lesson of this battle. Civilizations often remember their victories, but they rarely remember the moments when survival itself was the victory. The civilization that never knew how close it came. History has a strange habit. It remembers what happened. It rarely remembers what almost happened. The civilizations that survive often appear from a distance, as if their continuation was guaranteed. Their institutions seem permanent. Their victories seem inevitable. Their influence appears to have followed a natural path from the past into the present. But that is an illusion created by survival. The people who lived through the crisis did not know the ending. They did not know whether their armies would recover. They did not know whether their enemies would continue advancing. They did not know whether the political system they inherited from previous generations would still exist in the years ahead. They only knew that something fundamental had been threatened. And for a brief moment, the future of an entire civilization depended on decisions made under fear, uncertainty, and impossible pressure. The forgotten battle was not important because it destroyed Western civilization. It was important because it revealed how close civilization could come to transformation. The danger was not a single dramatic moment where everything disappeared overnight. History rarely works that way. The true danger was a chain reaction, a military defeat weakening political authority, political weakness encouraging rebellion, rebellion dividing resources, division preventing recovery. Recovery becoming impossible because every new crisis arrived before the previous one had been solved. Civilizations often survive because these chains break somewhere. A commander makes a different decision. A city refuses to surrender. An alliance remains loyal. An enemy advances too cautiously. A surviving army reorganizes. A few hours create a different future. That is what makes this battle so fascinating. The outcome was not determined by destiny. It was shaped by human choices. The soldiers who fought there did not know they were protecting future generations. They were not thinking about history books. They were thinking about survival, holding a position, following an order, protecting a comrade, escaping the battlefield, reaching safety. But history is often built from ordinary people making decisions during extraordinary moments. The men who survived carried more than memories. They carried continuity. They preserved the possibility that the civilization behind them could recover. They allowed institutions to continue. They allowed leaders to rebuild. They allowed future generations to inherit a world that still resembled the one before the crisis. And because that recovery happened, later generations forgot the fear that came before it. This is one of history's greatest paradoxes. The more successful a civilization is at surviving a crisis, the easier it becomes to underestimate that crisis. A disaster avoided leaves fewer visible traces than a disaster that occurred. There are no ruins of cities that were never conquered. There are no monuments to armies that escaped destruction. There are no records describing political systems that almost replaced the ones that survived. The futures that never happened leave almost no evidence. Only imagination allows us to see how narrow the path was. That does not mean we should believe that one battle alone controls all of history. Civilizations are complicated. They are built from millions of people, countless decisions, and endless interactions. A different outcome would not automatically create one predictable future, but it would create new possibilities, new rulers, new alliances, new borders, new conflicts, new ideas. History is not a single road. It is a landscape filled with paths that disappear the moment one decision is made. The people living through this crisis stood at one of those intersections. They could not see the alternatives. They could only act, and their actions preserved the path that eventually led to the world we know. That is why forgotten battles deserve attention. Not because they provide simple lessons about heroes and villains, not because they prove that one side was destined to win, but because they reveal something more uncomfortable. The world we inherit is often the result of moments when survival was uncertain. The institutions, cultures, and traditions that seem permanent today survived because people in the past managed problems that once appeared impossible. They faced enemies they could not fully understand. They made decisions without enough information. They accepted risks they could not avoid. They fought battles whose consequences extended far beyond their own lifetimes. And sometimes, they succeeded just enough. That may be the most accurate way to describe the survival of civilizations. Not through perfection, not through unstoppable power, through adaptation, through endurance. Through individuals continuing to act even when the outcome was unclear. The forgotten battlefield eventually became quiet. The armies disappeared. The commanders became names in history. The fear that once surrounded the conflict faded, but the lesson remained. Civilizations are not protected only by their strength. They are protected by their ability to respond when strength is no longer enough. The most dangerous moment is not always when an enemy attacks. Sometimes it is when a civilization believes it cannot be threatened, because confidence can hide weaknesses, success can hide vulnerabilities, and survival can create the false impression that survival was always guaranteed. It was not. The people who lived through this moment did not know whether their world would continue. They only knew that they had reached the edge. And at that edge, through strategy, sacrifice, uncertainty, and circumstances no one could fully control, the collapse did not happen. The civilization continued. The future remained open, and centuries later people would inherit that future without realizing how close they had come to losing it.